Hello, today we're going to talk about the Defence of the Realm Act. Now, the Defence of the Realm Act was an act introduced by the government during World War One in order to protect people and protect society. They saw the beginning of World War One, which they called the Great War, as being a real threat to the way of life in Britain and to Britain itself. And so they felt that it was necessary to introduce a series of laws that they felt would protect society and prevent any threat of society being damaged by German invasion or by any kind of threats from external forces. Now, obviously, the Defence of the Realm Act was something done to restrict freedoms in order to protect people, and in many ways, that makes it something that can be compared quite easily to modern day events, and in particular the events surrounding the lockdown and coronavirus and the various measures that the government has introduced over the period since the beginning of 2020. So today we're going to look at the Defence of the Realm Act and maybe think about how it can be compared to events of the modern day. So Defence of the Realm Act is often just referred to as DORA, and DORA just is the kind of acronym Defence of the Realm Act, and it was introduced right at the start of the war. So the war begins in August 1914. 4 days after the war begins, the government legislates, that means creates a series of laws in order to protect society as they saw it. And throughout the war, this act was amended, and to amend an act is just to change it and to introduce new parts to the law that slightly alter or slightly change some of its provisions. And as the law changed throughout the war, the government gained more and more control over people's lives, and people's freedoms were limited to a certain extent, and the government was able to direct people in a way that was just not possible out with periods of national crisis. So in many ways it was introduced to protect the British people and to help win the war. These were measures that were thought necessary in order to do something important. And so therefore it has a huge number of similarities to the new laws that surround COVID-19 and introduction of various measures to mitigate and limit the spread of coronavirus and protect the NHS. A lot of people see this as an example of something called state power. Now, state power is just this idea that the government has control over your lives, and the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA, gave the government a huge amount of power and control over the lives of ordinary people. They saw it as a time of real national crisis, and it was a time of real national crisis. There was an imminent threat to the nation, and so government decided it was reasonable to limit the freedoms of individual people in order to protect society as a whole, much in the same way that coronavirus is a time of national crisis. It is a very, very real threat to the people of Britain and the people of the world, and so the government is able to introduce laws that limit people's freedoms because they think that protecting society is more important. And so they have the best interest of people at, and the purpose of the legislation is that they want to save lives, they want to protect the NHS, and they want to make sure that society is safe. Now, as I've said, there are a lot of comparisons we make between World War One and COVID-19 measures and COVID-19 laws, and so that's one of the things to think about when you're revising this, is to think about what measures were introduced then that can be compared to today, and how people responded to those sort of changes. And that's because there's really two different types of things you can be asked about DORA in the exam. You could be asked a describe question, and a describe question might just ask you to describe the various provisions of DORA. It might ask you to describe the various different laws that DORA introduced. And so in order to do that, so that might be just a simple describe question, or it might be a how fully question, or it might be an evaluate question. So it will ask you to name some of the examples of changes introduced by DORA, and you just have to state them. You know, one of the changes introduced by DORA was, another of the changes introduced by DORA was, and so on. But you can also be asked an explain style question, and this question will ask you to think about people's reaction to DORA and why some of the regulations introduced in the Defence of the Realm Act angered and upset some people, and they felt that their freedoms were being restricted, much in the same way that some of the laws and changes introduced under COVID-19 legislation have been criticised, on the radio and social media and things like that by various people who feel that their freedoms are being restricted. So there is again a real similarity there. Now, there are a huge number of sections to the Defence of the Realm Act. With the questions in the exam, you'd only have to be able to know a maximum 6, because 6 marks is the most you can get for a question where you have to describe or explain things. In the 9-mark essay question, you only need 5 points of knowledge. So I've tried to break them down into sections and not kind of overwhelm you with a huge number. So first one is censorship. Now, the government introduced a significant amount of censorship during World War I under the terms of DORA in order to prevent news getting out about troops, or in order to stop discontent, that's kind of bad feeling, fear spreading through the population. So one of the things they introduced was that invisible ink was banned. If you were writing a letter abroad, you weren't allowed to use invisible ink, and this was to prevent spies passing secret messages. Newspapers and letters were censored, so any information about military defeats or movement of troops or things like that would be kept out of the newspapers. And letters from the front would be censored, so they couldn't talk about, where your unit had been, or a battle they'd been involved in, or how many of your friends had died. And part of the reason for that was to stop any kind of bad feeling, any sort of anti-war sentiment spreading from the front back to the people at home. But it was also done because there was a real danger that letters could be captured by the enemy, and if these letters were captured and they had lots of information in them, then the Germans and that could use those letters in order to gain an advantage. We were also banned from talking about the army or navy in public places. This is again to stop fear from spreading throughout Britain, so you couldn't talk about things that were going on, and it also prevented spies from having the opportunity to be able to gain information. So if you knew something about what was happening on the front, or what was happening in the ports or the docks or with certain ships, you weren't allowed to talk about it because there was a chance that spies could overhear it, and you weren't allowed to spread rumours. And again, this is to stop fear from spreading, much in the same way that with COVID-19 a lot of people have been banned from Twitter and Facebook and things like that for spreading misinformation. That same thing happened during World War I with starting kind of false rumours about the army or the navy. There are also significant restrictions about what you could do with land and where you could go. So the government had the right to basically take over any property. Any bit of land anywhere in the country could be seized by the government and turned over to food production. This is obviously because during the war, food becomes a big issue, and the British need to be able to feed themselves becomes very important, and so the government can basically take over fields, or take over parks, take over land, take over football pitches, cricket pitches, all those kind of things, and turn them over to wheat production or potato production or whatever. People were also banned from going to certain places, mainly around about railways and docks, because they were seen as kind of key infrastructure. So you couldn't go to a dock area, so people couldn't visit the docks in Glasgow, or they couldn't visit the docks in London, because that's the sort of place where spies were seen to be able to do the most damage. And the same is true of railways. Railways moving troops or goods around could, in theory, be quite easily destroyed or damaged by moving some of the tracks, and so you weren't allowed to go anywhere near key railways or key docks because they were seen as a threat and a danger. Perhaps the most difficult thing for people to endure during the war was the restriction on pubs, which is again something that's similar to kind of issues that people are finding today. So opening hours in pubs were cut, there was a very, very severe limitation to the hours that pubs could be open. This obviously angered people. The pubs couldn't stay open late at night, they couldn't stay open for long periods. And so many people were angry because that was a large part of their social life involved going to the pub, particularly for working men. And in order to prevent drunkenness, which would lead to a kind of problem with productivity and people not be able to do their jobs properly, the beer that was served in pubs was watered down, so the alcohol content was lessened, and that would mean that you would need to drink a lot more of it in order to get drunk, which stopped people from getting as drunk as they would have. And buying rounds was banned. Usually when you go to the pub, you go in with a couple of your friends and you buy them all a drink, and because you've bought them a drink, they will then buy you a drink, and then it goes round. So if you go in with 4 or 5 friends, then you might end up having 5 drinks because you feel obliged to buy everybody a drink who's bought you a drink. And so the idea of buying rounds kind of encourages people to drink more. So if you just go in and you're only allowed to buy a drink for yourself, this was meant to prevent people from drinking as much, which did tend to work quite well. And then some general restrictions that were introduced include banning melting down gold or silver. Melting down gold or silver is the sort of thing you can do in order to create easily transferable money or easily transferable wealth. So you weren't allowed to do that in order to prevent spies and things like that from being able to get access to money, but also prevents the financial system from being damaged by people introducing huge amounts of gold or silver into at given points, which could have caused a lot of problems. Bonfires or fireworks are banned. These were seen as possibly dangerous, a threat, and also people might get scared if they weren't sure what was going on, if lots of things were on fire and there were those kind of things. So fireworks and bonfires are banned. And finally, church bells are banned from being rung, because the ringing of church bells was seen as a sign that the Germans were coming, there was an invasion coming and those kind of things. So bells were banned from being rung, and so at the end of the war, when this law was repealed, when it was ended and the war was over, church bells rang out throughout the country. So those are some of the parts of DORA. Hopefully that is quite a good overview, and it kind of helps you understand the main parts of the Defence of the Realm Act.